Hi there, Telebait here, and today I've got a bit of a different video for you. So we're going to take a look at the meta stats from Mobalytics, look at the top 5 decks, and I'll go through each of them one at a time and explain how I approach the matchup into each of these decks. It's just because knowing how to beat your opponent's deck is almost as important as knowing how to play your own deck. And if you find this video helpful, please do leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my other guides teaching you how to become the best Legends of Runeterra player that you can be. And throughout this video, if you think I miss off any key tips, post them in the comments below and help each other out. Okay, the first deck on this list is Spider Aggro. And this is a deck which I've featured on my channel already, and it's a very, very strong deck for climbing. And that's just because it's so fast and can beat people down really, really quickly. This is a sort of standard deck list. They do vary slightly. But in general, the idea is that you beat people down using aggressive early units. That's why it's got 9 1-drops. Sorry, 12 1-drops. And you use the Fearsome keyword to get a lot of attacks in. And you combine Fearsome with Frenzy Skitterer to lower your opponent's attack, meaning that only their 4 attack units can block. And 4 attack units really aren't that common, especially when you've got a whole board of Fearsomes. Your opponent's likely to have 1, maybe 2 4 attack units, and so Frenzy Skitterer is an absolute power card in this deck. And then towards the end of the game, you use cards like Noxian Fervor and Decimate to finish off your opponent. That's how the deck works, and the main weakness to this is any sort of healing. So Targon and Shadow Isles and Freylord decks are really, really strong into this. Targon just has so much healing, like there's no way this deck can beat a Targon deck. And same with popular decks like Lissandra Trundle, Shadow Isles, Freylord combination, things like Avalanche absolutely shut down this deck. But if you're not playing one of these hard counters to the deck, you need to really focus on minimizing how much value your opponent gets from cards like Frenzy Skitterer and Noxian Fervor. So you want to keep your removal to cancel out Noxian Fervor, and you want to always be careful about playing your free attack units if your opponent could potentially play a Frenzy Skitterer afterwards. So those are the 2 key cards I play around, and you also want to stop Elise leveling up. If this deck levels up Elise, the game is basically over. So those are the key moments you really need to play around. But as with all aggro decks, there are sometimes, if you get a bad draw, aggro will just absolutely punish you hard. This is a very strong deck, but it does have some very, very big counters in the meta. The decks I'd definitely recommend to counter this are Zoe Aurelian Soul decks and Lissandra Trundle decks. Okay, on to the next deck, and this is something I'm kind of surprised, actually, that it's so popular, which is Jarvan Shen. This is like an updated version of the Fiora Shen archetype, but since Fiora got nerfed, she's pretty bad, and Fiora kind of got replaced by Laurent Protégé, and then the late game units in this deck got replaced by Jarvan and Jarvan the Third. And honestly, I don't know why this deck is so popular, and it's got a decent win rate. I just don't think it's that strong. The way the deck works is kind of you play your units and you get good trades with your units using spells, particularly Barrier. So you combine Barrier with Challenger and use this to remove your opponent's board. Because of this, it's a very board reliant deck, and in general, board reliant decks are just not that strong because they're too interactable. And that's the big thing with this deck. If you can remove their units from the board, the deck absolutely struggles. And you just need to play around all your opponent's combat tricks so that you can remove them as well as possible. So usually this is sort of like a typical lineup. They run lots of 2-ofs, different combat tricks. That's because you can get River Shaper, and you use River Shaper to draw lots of different spells. You just need to be aware of all the combat tricks your opponent plays. And most crucially about this deck, be aware when they don't play a combat trick that you probably would in the same situation. Because if they don't play it in the situation where you would play it, maybe they don't have it in hand, and you really need to hand read your opponent well to work out what combat tricks they don't have and how you can play around them. And the other thing is the crucial removal spells in this deck, so always be aware of single combat and concerted strike, and try and deny your opponent getting too much value with them. And my general strategy against decks like this is you can't play around every single thing they have. It just doesn't work. So you really need to go in for the kill on your opponent's units when they burn out of mana. So when they've just played a big unit, so if they've just played Shen using 4 mana, then they're going to be low on mana, not have as many combat tricks available, So that's when you should go in and push on a kill for his units. Or if he's just dropped Screeching Dragon, if they're banking lots and lots of mana, they've probably got quite a few combat tricks and a good way to answer whatever you do. In terms of a counter for this deck, the best counter is definitely something like Draven Ezreal. And Draven Ezreal just has an absolute ton of removal, which gets rid of all these units. And as soon as you remove the units from the board, all of these cards become dead cards in their hand, and you're just going to win the game. So if you're going up against a lot of Jarvan and Shen, something like Draven Ezreal will be really good into this deck. Next most popular one is Targon Lee. So this has been an archetype which has been very, very strong for a while now, and is reliant on the Lee Sin one-turn kill. So you buff up Lee with gems or mentor or various other buffs you have, give him Overwhelm with Zenith Blade, and then you use his level up effect to kill your opponent from 20 Nexus health in one attack. And ever since the introduction of Zoe has given this deck a bit more of an alternative win condition. If you level up Zoe, that's just another way you can win. So the big thing about playing against this deck is you really need to try and remove Lee Sin when you can, or threaten your opponent in such a way that he can't play Lee Sin. So if you have a removal spell such as Vengeance on Lee Sin, and they can play Lee Sin, but it would put them below 4 mana, so they can't use Deny, keep that 7 mana up so they can't play Lee Sin. The later they play Lee Sin, the better for you. And that's really all this deck comes down to, like, if you can beat Lee Sin. And there are a lot of good hard counters for this deck. So decks that I'd recommend to play against this are Nightfall. I've got a Nightfall deck on my channel, and that will absolutely smash Lee Sin decks. Other decks that are quite good, Zoe Aurelion Soul decks are quite good, just because they have a lot of removal and Lee Sin struggles to survive that. You have to play it very, very well to win with that deck against Lee Sin. Decks with lots of freezes also disrupt Lee Sin, because they can buff up Lee Sin, give him Overwhelm, and then as soon as you freeze him, he does 0 damage. So certain things like LeBlanc Ash are really, really good into this deck as well. I also want to add, there's a lot of cards you need to be aware of that your opponent can play in this archetype. Mostly Deny, Nopify, and Bastion being able to disrupt your removal, so you want to be playing around them as much as possible. Sometimes, if you're against a good player, they'll always keep 4 mana up to protect their Lee, so you just have to get rid of all the Denies and Bastions and then remove the Lee. And it's important to recognize when you're against a good player who will do this, and when you're against a less good player who might burn themselves out of Deny mana. Next on the list is Discard Aggro. And now this is a popular deck for a very long time. I actually slightly disagree with this list. Actually, I disagree with this list a lot, but they don't change much. The key cards are still the same. So the way this deck works is they swarm your board with a bunch of units and then use cards like Arena Battlecaster or Vision to buff up the attack of those units to do a lot of damage to your Nexus. They can also use cards like Crowd Favorite, which gets massive buffs from wide board. So it's really simple with this deck. Just try and make their board as small as possible. The smaller board, the less they'll be able to do. In general, of cards that you should be playing around a lot is things like Get Excited Burn to your Nexus. So always be aware that they can use 1 or 2 Get Excited to your Nexus. Vision is also a big card, and it plays when discarded, so they can cast it for free using one of Draven's axes. That's something to be massively aware of when you're trading in your units. And the other thing to be aware of is Augmented Experimenter, dealing free to one of your units. You don't want to let them get too much good value from Augmented Experimenter. And in general, this is another aggro deck, and aggro decks are just one of those where you either have a deck which is incredible against them or really, really bad. So it has the same sort of weaknesses as other aggro decks. So regions such as Shadow Isles and Freljord and Targon are really, really good. And you've used any deck. So what I always recommend against aggro is Zoe Aurelion Soul and Shadow Isles Freljord decks such as Lissandra Trundle, and you'll be absolutely fine against these decks. Okay, and the last deck on this list is Trundle Lissandra. And this is a big one in the meta at the moment. I think this, my personal opinion, is this is the strongest deck in the meta at the moment. It does have some weaknesses though, which we'll get onto in a moment. So the way this whole deck works is you look to play Trundle turn 5, 6, or 7. Then you play his Ice Spit Pillar on turn 8. You use Fading Memories to copy it. You then can play Lissandra and get a Watcher in your hand. The following turn, you can then play Spectral Matron to summon out the Watcher, and now the 2 pillars, Spectral Matron and the Watcher, will count as your 4 8 cost units or more to reduce the Watcher's cost to 0. You can then play the Watcher, or use Fading Memories on the Watcher to summon more Watchers and obliterate your opponent's deck, and there's not really much they can do to stop it. It's just such a strong combo when it goes off. And on top of this, the deck has a lot of ways to deal with aggro decks such as Avalanche, Blighted Ravine, Withering Whale. Just these cards are great at dealing with the aggro decks, which are very popular in the meta. So if you're looking to climb against aggro decks, I'd highly recommend playing this sort of deck right now. But in terms to beat it, you really need to have that sort of mid-game power to beat this deck. And the key is having units with 3 or more health, because this then plays around cards like Avalanche and Blighted Ravine, Vile Feast, Withering Whale, Ice Shards. All of these cards, they'll have to commit multiple cards to kill one of your units with 3 health. So that's the key to playing this deck. Don't focus too much on swarming your board. Focus on playing those big, strong units that your opponent will struggle dealing with. And then you need to put on enough pressure that they can't spend their turn on turn 8 setting up their Watcher combo. Instead, they have to constantly use all their mana just to survive, because you're putting them under that much pressure. If you're not able to put them under that much pressure early on, you're going to have a hard time against this deck. And the key cards to play around are just all their AoE removals. Just always try and play around Avalanche, Blighted Ravines, Ice Shards, Withering Whales, and Ruination. Ruination is always a difficult one to play around, and in this version, as it's one of, some versions it's 2 ofs. If it was just a 1 of, I wouldn't bother playing around Ruination too much and just mostly just hope they don't draw it. But because there's a lot of versions which run 2 ofs, I would suggest, if you encounter this deck on ladder, to always be playing around Ruination. And the way you do this is turn 6 onwards, if they have 3 mana banked, so they have enough mana to play Ruination, always look to do open attacks or burst plays. The reason like the Shadow Isles Freljord combo is so strong is because you always get kind of forked with this decision of, do you open attack or do you develop? Because developing is bad into Ruination, whereas open attacking is bad into things like Withering Whale, Vengeance, which this version of this deck doesn't have, but a lot of versions do run, and Vile Feast. So it's always a big, tough choice, and you always have to play it out in your head of, can you play around the Ruination? If them having the Ruination means they always win, just don't play around it and develop and hope they don't have it. That's the decision you've got to go in your head. If you can play around the Ruination through open attacking or rallies are a very good way to get around this card, because it allows you to open attack, develop, and then you can attack again. You can play around the Ruination, but there are definitely some decks which struggle to play around Ruination, and if you're playing against as an aggro deck, you also can't really play around Avalanche. So if you're an aggro deck, you kind of just have to act like they don't have Avalanche or Blighted Ravine to win. So in terms of counters to this strategy, I've kind of hinted towards a couple of them, but things like Rally, so Shen J4, very good into this. Units which are a bit more beefy, so LeBlanc Ashe will be very good into this. Lucian Azir is another deck which is great into this deck. And I've actually got a Marauders deck on my channel using LeBlanc and Demacia, and that deck is really good into this as well. It's just decks with lots of rallies this deck struggles with, and when you're playing these decks against Lich Trundle, what you have to do is you always open attack, then you develop, then you rally, then you attack again. Because that's the best way to play around the Ruination, which is a very strong card against these mid-range strategies, which is why you need the rallies to play around. Okay, so that was my very brief overview of how to play around these decks. I've been recording for about 20 minutes now, so I've managed to do it quicker than I thought it would. So hopefully you've sat through all of this, and hopefully it'll help you out on the ladder. If you found this video helpful, let me know in the comments below, because I'll definitely look to do more and improve on it in the future. And if you want to see more of my Runeterra guides, please do subscribe. Until next time, have a good day.